I am, a little bit.
Alright, so we are with China, developing world, and the new global dynamic. Hopefully, you read a little bit of it. Alright, so we're just going to jump into the chapters, and then we'll probably take like a 5-minute break or whatnot, and then talk about our specific regions, and then hopefully divide you guys up into your specific regions, and kind of just have some discussion regarding China's level of development and where it poses, I guess, different outlines for future developing countries.
Alright, so right here's just some information about the authors. I'm not going to read that, but China had, similar to the Washington Consensus, they kind of constructed their own version that dealt a lot with how they wanted to construct their own security and also how they wanted to interact with other countries in the global south. It is referred to throughout the book as the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. They're all listed right there. Throughout the book, when we're talking about how China interacts with all of these different regions, you can kind of decide how, I guess, strictly China adheres to these, because it's kind of ambiguous at times, but some important things to kind of note, especially like the mutual respect for territory and also the non-interference. You can kind of see where that contrasts to some of like U.S. policy and also some non-state actors, where things like the IMF will say, you know, we're not going to invest in you unless you are willing to cooperate or privatize these industries, etc. Or they're not willing to interact with certain regimes. China is not as strict about that. They're really just willing to interact with anyone, and that's kind of prevalent when we'll go into more specific regions.
So I mean, I think these are pretty important. I'm pretty sure they reference every single chapter. So you guys like have a general idea of them, maybe want to snap a picture, write them down, just for future reference, maybe in discussions. Because I do think these are pretty prevalent through all of the chapters, and do give a good way in on whether China is a developing country and whether they're a better model for developing countries. So if you have those written down, when that, say when someone next to you has something written down, like, we'll say yes. Alright, so our second chapter, so our first chapter was very short. The second chapter really goes into detail. It actually references one of the questions pretty much, which is like the shift from the new economic order that China had from the old, and that really did get brought about, as was discussed earlier in the prior presentation, by the PRC, the People's Republic of China. Like that shift, and when it was established, they did bring about the 5 separate principles, which you guys should have written down. And there was also a lot of discussion regarding China, the heart of the struggle between the East and West, so the Soviet bloc against the Western powers, so that being a struggle there, and China really not being able to play a part in that, because originally they were supposed to be, originally when the PRC came about, they out of who knows how, they won the revolution and came about as a communist state, or a socialist state, but was had some serious conflict with the Soviet Union, so they had a continued struggle whether to adopt Soviet policy or follow Soviet example, or stick with the West, or not even deal with the West. And there was also, out of that came about like the 3 worlds thesis from Mao, and the 3 worlds thesis, one of the worlds is friendlies, so friendlies would be one of the friends, or I'm sorry, enemies. So friendlies believe in 5 principles of peaceful coexistence and legitimacy of China. Those were 2 like of the major requirements that China had. So as Jack talked about before, where China didn't really have any contingencies, that was one of them. So it was a belief in the 3 or 5 peaceful coexistence principles, and then the belief that China is a legitimate state. The enemies were all those associated with the West and U.S. imperialism, so everyone that pretty much was not going to south. And then the neutrals were, surprisingly, it said, were the most difficult to deal with because they were just unaffiliated and really were hesitant towards every single imperialistic or China-oriented growth. So the 5 principles represent a viable and ethical alternative to Western models based on power politics, use of force, and lack of respect for sovereignty or sovereign equality. So again, the five principles to peaceful coexistence. And as I just discussed, that was the center and the heart of the new international economic order that the Chinese government had. So we go to chapter 3. Actually, I think I have more slides. So as Jack referenced before, huge contrast with the Washington Consensus. And I guess the final comment I would make, I'm going to reference quite a bit, is with China, and I don't know if I should put it with ASEAN, but the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, that was also, these were essentially the friendlies that in my chapters, which I'm going to talk about, and in the beginning chapters, those were the friendlies that China references and Mao references in this three worlds theory. So keep those in mind as well. Well, now we'll go into chapter 3.
Alright, so chapter 3 was about China's transition into a new trading nation. As a trading nation, China's need for oil, gas, raw materials, minerals, and foreign markets, and its position in globalized manufacturing that are closely tied to Southeast Asia, strengthening its ties to developing economies. So I think it was in the 1990s, China went from a net exporter of oil to a net importer. So they realized like they had to develop ties with developing nations that had a lot of energy resources, need for natural resources, forced change to economic and foreign policy. So like a lot of China's foreign policy is driven by its domestic needs. So like as China increased manufacturing and increased its need for energy resources, it increased its relationships with developing nations. As you can see. Next slide. Yeah. So there are some problems with China as a trading nation. China may be perpetuating the use of low-quality labor for resource extraction in return for the importation of Chinese manufactured goods. One particular case was in Zambia in their copper mines, where they've been giving workers 12 to 18-hour shifts and had like really lax safety laws and pretty much like kind of ignored all labor laws in Zambia. Which, yeah, that's not good. And yeah, China's growth kind of forces other countries on like the back burner in terms of foreign direct investment, FDI. So yeah, China's growth also challenges many developing countries as China's lack of trade unions and its coercive local state keeps wages low, bringing in many new enterprises to China. China's ability to attract so much FDI comes in part at the expense of other developing countries which see their share of new FDI falling. It also decreases labor quality in other developing countries because they're trying to compete with the low labor costs of China. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
So before we get into like the regional studies, so a lot of our chapters were actually just regional studies, actually pretty much divided up into your groups, so it's pretty cool. Except our first chapter was our Southeast Asia group, which is us, so that's fantastic. But so before we get into those studies, I would just like to comment on the book, and maybe you guys can comment as well. This book was definitely, I would say it was about as far as a Western perspective you could hope for, while also comparing it to the West and thinking of China as a alternative model. So it definitely, I would say in my chapters specifically, brought about the good sides of China. So I also tried to bring about, as for example here, some abuses of human rights, not necessarily paint China in a bad light, but also just give some different discussion and hopefully feed into your questions like, is China a good alternative model for development? Or are the new international economic orders that China presents, are they positive? Should we only focus on economics instead of human rights or a lot of other things like political review, political aspects that China doesn't really focus on? So I was just, I want to bring that to light if you guys have any comments on that, just about the book's kind of scope in general.
Yeah, it's definitely really pro-China. It's kind of hard to find like really anything bad about China in this.
Which is directly opposed to last week's book, the BRICS book, where we had a section on Ecuador where it was just an entire section where Ecuador was just being treated like I don't know, terrible.
Yeah, plenty of committee reviews. And so, yeah, my specific sections were on South Asia, which was kind of an ambiguous region, but I referred to it as like India and Pakistan predominantly, and I also worked with Latin America. It focused a lot more, I guess, on like the macro aspect and looking more a lot at like how investment and that kind of things have changed rather than how it's actually working at the ground level and how this is affecting things like the labor force, et cetera. So I think the macro view in general kind of just tends to paint China in a more positive light, but
Yes, so I just want to bring that to light, especially the macro view there. I think that's a good example. So if you guys have any other questions before we go into regional, maybe we'll take a 5-minute break. If anyone doesn't have any questions. Okay, all right, 5-minute break, and then we'll come back to the regional slides.